So we'll give people till about 11 so that they can all get into the Zoom room. If you'd like to say hello in the chat, or if you've got any questions as we go along, we'll try and pick them up as we go. We've got John Kelly's here and Peter Lacey. Peter, are you? If you just say hello.
Hi there. Sorry, automatically on mute.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Peter, are you sharing slides this morning?
I have one slide to have up whilst I'm describing what we're doing.
Excellent, excellent. If you'd, do you just want to try that out now, just to make sure you can share your screen, and then we can practice that.
Don't want to give away my thunder. That's the only problem.
No, no. Quick, hide it now. Hide it now. Yeah, hide it. That's a good. That looks like a good graph. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, it works.
I'll stop. Yeah, it works.
Yeah.
Quick flick of the petticoat.
Yes, there we go. Yeah, yeah. And we've got people are just joining in the waiting room, which is great. It's always the jeopardy when you start these things, and then sort of 5 minutes to go, there's no one here, and actually people came. It's amazing. It's morning. So yeah, I'll just try and fill for 5 minutes as we go along. We've got some new faces, which is great, and we've got some great talks. So this morning we've got a little bit of news. So the OpenDataSavesLives.org website is now up and running and fully live. So we'll put a link in the chat to that. And people are still joining. Open Data Saves Live started as a response between ODI leads and beautiful information in April, with the response of what we're going to do, how do we share, how do we respond, and now we're up to 20 sessions. We've now got a nice rhythm of 2 a month. One is more health focused, one is more data and outward looking, if you like, from the health sector. And today's one of those more outward looking sessions where we've got John Kelly from North Yorkshire talking about how they're using data and forecasting. We've got Peter Lacey, who's whilst he's talking about working inside the health sector, it's about forecasting. What do we do that? And then Stian, who's Westlake, who's the chief exec of the Royal Statistical Society. He's going to be talking about communicating in a pandemic, and he may well mention some of those graphs that we've seen that probably weren't helpful when people were overstating the case of having an exponential growth when we knew that probably wouldn't happen, but we know it's very serious. So there's Stian's going to join us, and the way this works is that I jabber on and sort of fill until about 5 past, then we'll start. I think we're going to start with John first, then to Peter, and then to Stian. We're going to try and finish within the hour. If people have got questions, if you can put it in the chat, would be great. Oh no, Graham, what are you talking about? You're getting washing.
We're just talking about washing from yesterday.
I was really worried about his washing.
I was failing at being an adult yesterday.
Oh my god! Oh my god! So put questions in the chat, and then also we've got a request is that if people would like to join in with Open Data Saves Lives, if they would like to align their work with us, please think about that. Have a think about that. We'll be announcing some projects and approaches in 2021 where we're looking to put some real investment and go faster stripes on our work into 2021. And I think if people think about the challenges they've got or the work they're working on or how they would like to work with others, one of the big things we've found about Open Data Saves Lives is that working in this way makes it so much easier for people in different organizations, from different sectors, from different organizational perspectives to work together on similar projects and get what they want out of it. And we don't have to have set up an SLA agreement or have interminable conference calls. We just get on with it, and people can take the value that they want out of that. So have a think about that as well. So all right, but people are already moaning in the chat. It's great, fantastic. What do you mean by align with us? Louise said there. Basically, if we work on the same things, and work out what the objective is, we do that in the open, and if we get it wrong, we fix it as we go. So set the mission, work on that. Okay, so we're at 5 past. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to introduce you to John Kelly, who's going to tell us who he is, what has he been doing, and ODLEs, we've been following the work at North Yorkshire data science team on Twitter. Where else would we be watching it? Of course we are. Also it's great because I grew up in Scarborough and I grew up in North Yorkshire, which is obviously the largest county in England, and we remind people about that a lot, about that. So yeah, God's own county and all of that stuff. So over to you, John. Tell us who you are, where you're from, and what you've been working on.
Brill, thanks for the intro. Yeah, Scarborough's a lovely place. Obviously, not a place to be in the last couple of weeks with what were we, the 5th highest? That was the 5th highest rates. It looks like it's on the come down now, so that's good. But yeah, my name's John Kelly. I'm head of data and intelligence at North Yorkshire County Council. So got a large team here. My team's responsible for the production of all data assets across the county. We do all of the stat returns. We do all of the social care work and activity. And obviously this year, we've been knee deep in providing support for COVID response. That's pretty much what I want to talk about, because as part of that, we built a product that helps us make some decisions around it. It does use open data, and it also feeds some communication activities too. So if I share my screen and talk you through it, bear with me. Okay, let me just reduce the size of that there. Okay, so what we called this is the Cluster Insight tool. Now, a bit of background on it is we have information that comes from Public Health England. For the purposes of this demo, we've got that's been randomized information. So this isn't necessarily factual, but this process is effectively underpins the epidemic response on a daily basis. Data from this is used by the Director of Public Health and the intelligence teams to understand and predict risky outbreaks. So it helps kind of determine what the response is going to be, and part of the tool helps provide that. So I'll jump straight to the outbreak insight part of this. What you're seeing here is boundaries around all of the positive outbreaks that are currently active in North Yorkshire. As I said before, this isn't an accurate reflection because this is based on randomized data, but there is a view very much like this that's being used now live to understand and track all of the current active clusters of outbreaks. Now, if I have a look through here, you can see what effectively the product does in Power BI is it draws a boundary at this moment in time. It's a 2.5 kilometre boundary around all of those active cases, and it groups those as a cluster. It allows me to go right down to 50 meters. Sorry, no, it's 500 meters, not 50 meters. So I can redraw that. Obviously, those clusters get a lot smaller, but you can see, you know, perhaps unsurprisingly, around some of the large conurbations like Harrogate, there's still a reasonably large cluster of cases. But yeah, it does help us spot when a new cluster pops up and track that through. So some of the things that we do with that kind of help us forecast. Well, one of the things that we might be interested in is on any one particular cluster. If I just select one, bear with me. Okay, so this is around Lumby. I might want to see, well, what issues or what's the demographics look like within that cluster. Obviously, we know some things about COVID transmission, who it's more likely to affect, some of the risk factors that are more likely at play. So what the model does is it understands where that clusters are and separates those by the LSOAs underneath them. It allows us to do some simple things like what it's showing now. So an age breakdown, gender breakdown, and some IMD information, but also In the live product, not in this test one, we do some additional things. So we talk about digital inclusion prevalence. We talk about engagement with digital channels of, messaging, because one of the activities might well be if we have a particular cluster that we're interested in, or perhaps that, there's some risk factors in there that make us nervous. What we might want to do is assess that cluster's risk. If that's got a very high age prevalence, maybe some prevalence around very poor health, very poor digital inclusion, what we might find is we go out, we do some door knocking campaigns, we do some leaflet drops, we do some practical face-to-face stuff. If some of those risk markers don't reflect in that particular cluster, then we might perform some different actions, but that information is quite helpful in that. In terms of forecasting, another thing that always works terribly in a live demo, but we'll try it anyway, is the product itself processes that data on a daily basis. So what we're able to see, and what you can see here is, in effect, every cluster for the past 2 months on a daily basis that's been within that particular area, and I can play through that. And what it effectively does is it draws those boundaries over time as the active cases grow within that particular boundary area. So you can see here, although it's a bit jerky, probably because of my connection, it's drawing those per day, and you can see that growth within those particular areas. So that helps from 2 points of view. If someone's fresh, coming to identify a cluster that has existed for a while, we can understand how it's gotten to the point where it's at. If it's a new cluster, it does help us understand some of that transmission. Obviously, a big part of transmission at the moment is household, or had been until lockdown. Household is by far one of the biggest causes of that kind of what they call background transmission. I wouldn't pretend to be an epidemiologist, but there are obviously other areas of transmission, but this helps kind of pick that up. So in terms of forecasting, it really gives those public health consultants the right kind of ingredients to make some of those decisions, and all of that's quite helpful. And the last part about this tool that's probably worthwhile mentioning in this conversation is context. So basically what context does is very similar to the other two, where we're looking now specifically about some of the factors that are relevant in that cluster. It's showing me here what some of those cases are. Now I've just put a white box over this, crudely hiding some of those indicators. But what I'm able to do is say, okay, within that cluster, within those point types, I can actually draw some open data about CQC locations, how many hospitals are in that area, or more importantly, how many care homes, and open services for adult social care. So I can also plot in there, how many people are receiving services, adaptations, all of that sort of stuff. So I can say, well, show me all of the house services in that particular cluster. The live product goes another step further and starts to propose some calculations around, some of those services that we know maybe indicate someone being more vulnerable. Actually, on that, we've also got the clinically extremely vulnerable list in here. So, the number of clinically extremely vulnerable within a cluster is part of that risk assessment process that we go through. But in terms of that intelligence, it provides those public health consultants a really powerful way of responding to COVID and actually doing things that they would normally have been able to do, but because it kind of offloads a lot of the legwork to an automated process, it means that consultants and public health professionals are able to focus on response rather than building evidence bases, or that epidemiological background of a particular cluster or outbreak. So yeah, that's what we've been doing in North Yorkshire around COVID.
Perfect. Thanks for that, and right on time as well, which is great. So I've just come off mute. Could you just stop sharing your screen, and then we'll go to some of the questions. So I think this is a perfect example of why we've been running Open Data Saves Lives and why we've been collaborating with people, because this is obviously a powerful tool for North Yorkshire. And the questions in the chat is, how could this be, or how could we help you improve the tool? So Mark asked the question about applying some AI or machine learning and this to start automatically presenting information which was the most important to it. So could someone remix your code for Power BI and give you back a better product? And then there's a couple of questions that are saying, do all local authorities have this? And I think the answer is no. Or different levels of this. And part of the reason we're running Open Data Saves Lives is to help share information about these things, about what could be done, but also put people in touch with each other so that they can share themselves. And then the question is could we work something out so that we have a user group community working together to create great tools and make sure that you're near Cleveland, so someone living on that border gets the benefit of your data products, but they might live in Whitby and drive up to Redcar, and so they should be benefiting of that, shouldn't they? So there's some really interesting points there. So I guess over to you, John. Just have you thought about how you might share this, how you would do that, and that sort of thing?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, we did offer to local authorities to share the tool. I mean, it's been in place now since, in various forms. Obviously, it's developed as we've gone, but it's been in place since around about the end of June, beginning of July. We did share some of that with some local authorities. The problem was when we were sharing it was all other local authorities were running around, trying to figure out how they were going to do something, perhaps less looking at social media and other mechanisms that we're reaching out with to take advantage of this. So firstly, we are up for sharing the code behind some of this. Going through, I'll work from the latest and then go backwards. Is there much overhead for you to just build for everyone? Well, and it kind of ties in Louise's question above. We are using information that every local authority has access to. Every local authority gets data from PHE about positive test cases. There is some additional information that's used in there too. What you've seen is only really part of the product, but kind of a part that was relevant to this discussion. But it does pull from open data as well. So if you had the right expertise to stand up the solution with the code that we gave, and you fed your data in as opposed to ours, then you should be able to get similar results. I'm up for collaboration with other people. Frankly, I think one of the things that North Yorkshire's we want to get better at, in fact, it was a plan on our service plan for 2020, which all went sideways, was to really put some focus on about what we share transparently and openly, how we publish what we publish, because actually it's more about we're very keen. It's just about putting focus on it. So I think that's a 2021 push. So the result of not having done lots of it up to now is not being very clear about what's out there that can help. So yeah, there's something.
Oh, here we are. This is amazing, and this is one of the reasons for inviting you along, is to show what you can do. But I think the people involved in Open Data Saves Lives and yourselves, we should have a look at this tool and use it as an example of how could we share that with others. And if there is some overhead that North Yorkshire would need to help run it, how do we find the money to cover that overhead so that you could expand it for everyone, and we don't just lean on you for a hobby, so so it doesn't become a hobby project. We put some real infrastructure behind it so that if your tool is useful for everyone, that it gets built, and we put some resource behind that to make sure that it's done properly. So I think this is definitely one thing myself and Mark will take away. And think about how we could collaborate, and then maybe we have a chat with you, John, and saying, okay, well, if you were to provide this tool for every single local authority, what would be the cost? Yeah. And then also, let's think about being creative and innovative about how we would deliver that. Lots of people chucking in a couple of £1,000 each would probably cover your overhead to run this for everybody. And wouldn't need a discovery phase, a GDS design sign off, and then a procurement process, which would cost, well, before we even write a PO, you're at 50k, aren't you?
Absolutely.
So we need ways of moving quickly, and actually most local authorities need this now. So I think there's definitely some follow up we'll do on that.
Sounds good.
Okay, and Louise is involved in a care home, so she'd be keen as well. I think if people would just say they're interested in being involved, that's great. And then Grace, who's on the call from ODI Leeds, will pick that up. And Open Data Saves Lives, ODI Leeds, and Beautiful Info will come back with a bit of a think about how this could work. But yeah, thanks very much, John. That was fantastic. I'm just going to try and find. Stian's here. That's great. You've joined us. That's fantastic. And Peter Lacey, where are you?
Still here.
Yeah, there you are.
I'm still here.
If you could do the same, Peter, just tell us who you are, away from, and what you've been doing, and then we'll crack on.
Okay. Also in North Yorkshire.
Yes.
In one slide. And John, I think we need a conversation. And I can't remember whether you've been in touch with. I've got two hats. So I run Whole Systems Partnership. You've had a little bit of this in a previous meeting, although maybe not many of you were on it, from Sarah Overton from our work in Kent. But I live in Knaresborough, North Yorkshire, and I also have a hat of establishing, running, providing strategic input to the community support organisation for COVID for Knaresborough. And with, I'm actually using, John, you'll be pleased to know, the North Yorkshire BI output that's publicly available to inform our local community support organisation. So, and I could argue there could be even a closer symmetry between the two, which we might have a conversation about. So two hats, but the strategic Whole Systems Partnership hat. I'm just going to talk through this single slide and also give credit not only to the support that Kent and Medway have given us across health and social care, but also the wider team behind me. We're a relatively small team, but 4 or 5 of us. The list there on the right-hand side of open data that's used to triangulate and sense check our system dynamics model was provided to me by Chris Harwood, who's our public health analyst and modeler. So Whole Systems Partnership, a strategic consultancy, expertise in population health modelling as it informs NHS and social care strategic demand and capacity work. So we help the NHS answer questions about how much of what. And when these answers are complex, then the system dynamics approach, which many of you may be familiar with, is really helpful. And it obviously gives us some forecasting potential. Although the small chat at the start, the sort of warning signs about forecasts and exponential increases, and I've been just as PIISS soft with some of what's been going on as many of you. So COVID-19 clearly presents one of the biggest challenges to face since the NHS is its inception in terms of demand and capacity. Questions about capacity right the way across the system are being asked. But along with the rise in COVID cases, I've recognised and seen, I think it's been a marvellous opportunity for open sharing data that has previously been closed to people, as well as accelerating the use of open source data. So the slide being shared in front of you tells the story in brief. An SEIR model follows the progression of a virus through the population through susceptible, exposed, infected, and finally recovered, and that's what's underpinning the model. We, with permission, used in effect an open source model within the system dynamics community built by IC Systems in the States. System dynamics is regularly used for epidemiology and sort of progression of disease boom and bust type modeling. So we picked that up early in March, and at many iterations later, as we're finding out both about the disease and the virus and the progression and the way in which we behave in response to it, we've got an emerging model. The model outputs that you see here, which I'll explain in a moment, are only a week old, but we're at a significant sort of transition point, if you like, in terms of understanding the roadmap, not only in terms of the current lockdown, but also in terms of vaccination and mass testing. Many unknowns, and therefore caution and care. So the model that we've built, we've also been fortunate during the time that we've been building the model to access a group of volunteer actuaries who've helped us along the way. We've got a model that can be calibrated to any district, local authority, CCG up and down the country. We've done that for the North East and North Yorkshire and Yorkshire for purposes of informing strategic workforce planning and medical training places and the like. So, and also around other sort of strategic planning where there is a COVID overlay in terms of how we plan forwards. So the model itself generates new cases of COVID-19 from rates of exposure to others in different settings: home, work, education, retail, recreation. The more the contacts, the greater the transmission, ultimately, therefore, the more hospital admissions and deaths. And we apply the existing and anticipated restrictions in those contact rates and the evidence around to help us to do that. From the slide that you can see how mobility data for retail and recreation. So there's a little sort of inset there, mobility data, retail, that's an open source data set. It tracks what we were modeling, or rather it underpins the outputs of what we're modeling. So you can see there on the first peak how mobility data sort of fell through the floor, 20% of normal, rose gradually. There's a lovely little spike there in terms of just the last 3 days before the 4th of November when everybody went out to shop again, and down it goes to about 40% level. So that sort of data is being used regularly to import the model and then to help us to triangulate with the outputs that we see and the real data in terms of hospital admissions, deaths, and the likes. The triangulation with TTI data is a little bit more difficult because clearly it's not identifying everybody in the population who is either asymptomatic or symptomatic for a range of reasons. So to improve model forecasts, we're therefore rely on both a constant iteration and comparison with other sources. ONS infection survey provides us another triangulation point open to us. But in terms of where we're going, in terms of forecasting, my first master's degree was in meteorology. So the little chat about the rain yesterday, you needed to take advice from a decent weather forecaster. But if I distinguish between nowcasting and forecasting, it's a useful distinction we've made in the Kent work. In terms of the weather, if you look out of the window now, it's probably quite sunny. You can look up wind, you know whether to put a coat on or not in terms of whether it's going to rain in the next few days. But if you want to know whether to book your camping holiday next year, or whether it's going to be a beast from the east or a wet and soggy winter, you turn to forecasting rather than nowcasting, which is full of a whole range of other vagaries in terms of what's actually going to be happening. So the output that you see here, it's a two-year model. It's got the first peak, it's got the second wave. You'll see where we are just at the start of that climb up midway through November, and the point at which the model outputs there depart for hospital admissions across Kent and Medway. This is, you can see the inflection points with the impact forecast of the 5th of November lockdown. You've then got 4 outputs. You've got the red dotted line, which is the impact of that 4-week kick it down the road strategy to get us to a Christmas that we might be able to enjoy. More comment offline on that, I suspect. And all it does is kick it down the line. The pink dotted line is the potential impact of mass testing were it to be effective, and we've made some assumptions which we can share. And the fourth line is the start of a vaccination program. And depending on the rollout, then that will have different effects. And we are practically answering questions. We've got a meeting later this afternoon with the excess death management group in Kent. Do they or do they not need to open up extra mortuary capacity at some point? We were able to advise them they didn't need their big tents in the first wave. We forecast that. They stood them down, they didn't need them. Don't repeat it here because they haven't heard it yet, but I think they might need a bit in January and February. So the value of forecasting, not to give a certainty, but to give a sort of plan for the worst, hope for the best type approach, based on a whole range of iteration, local data, open data, all triangulating to provide something that's reasonable for local strategic planners. So that's what you see, that's what we've done. I've described a little bit about where it's available and where it's being applied, but happy to take other questions or have the conversation. John.
Fantastic, Peter. That's amazing. And if you just like to stop sharing, and then we can. There's a couple of questions come in the chat, which I'll go first. So Tom King asked everyone, well, are you modelling recovery and rehabilitation as well in there?
Yes. So the model scope takes it right the way. There's an epidemiological core, which is the SEIR. There's then obviously, as incidence occurs, then there's a rate at which people either contact 111 or go to their GP or whatever, and that's factored in. There is a death rate in the community without having to go into hospital, particularly in care homes and particularly in the first wave. It then flows through into a hospital sector where we're distinguishing between the different types of bed, whether it's an oxygenated or a ventilator bed, etc. Again, triangulation with emerging evidence around lengths of stay and different treatments. So we're sort of 20% better at keeping people alive this wave than first wave. And then the discharge pathways. So whether people need rehabilitation, etc. Where the model stops at the moment, but there's other modelling and thinking and planning around, is the long COVID. We've used the outputs from this model to inform NHS and care, social care restart programs across mental health, urgent care, etc. And clearly the COVID overlay is important in that respect, and understanding and learning, which everybody is doing at the moment, about the different syndromes associated with long COVID, from mental health through to physical and respiratory needs, is all work in progress. So that's quite a long answer to a, does it include?
Yes, it was quite, yeah. Very comprehensive. And I guess there's another question that this is brilliant, because lots of detailed questions about the model itself, and obviously
the model, there's one there. It's not Markovian. System dynamics is a series of equations that drive a stock flow structure and behaviour. So again, not time for detail there, but no, it's not Markovian. And
I feel a technical blog coming on.
No, I'll pass that.
Again, what I think this is great. Sharing this early, you're going to be using it in anger this afternoon. It really shows the value and some of the high quality work that's going on in the work here. And one of mine and Mark's jobs is to work out how we allow that to be shared in lots of places, and for people adjacent to each other to start using that work, and also that the people doing the work get paid for doing it. The model we're talking about is massively different to the way in which people usually buy stuff. So that if it's shared, great. Can we use it? And the people building it need to be paid to help people use it in the right way. So one of the things we need to do, I think, is to look at innovation around that whole using open source data and code, but the implementation within the health sector is something we need to look at. But it's fantastic work, and you can imagine how your work there, Peter, could be integrated with the work that John's done to start looking at, okay, this is John's telling you about the current state. This is exactly how it is now.
Yep.
And we could add, Mark's going to build an AI using Peter's forecast model to tell us what's going to happen next. We've just solved it, haven't we? That's the beauty of, we can have a conversation now about stitching the two things together to give us a view about what will be happening on Scarborough Seafront in February. That's the dream. Yeah. Good. So have we got any, there's some questions that we might want to pick up separately in the chat. But what I'd like to do now is to hand over to a good friend of ODI Leeds and Open Data Service Live, Stian Westlake. Stian, you can introduce yourself and give us a commentary on some of the things you've been seeing at the RSS about communicating in a pandemic.
Thanks very much. And thank you so much for inviting me today. It's been fascinating to see all this stuff all this amazing practice that's actually going on, and all of this is fantastic fodder for our work. In some ways, it makes me feel I'm somewhat here under false pretenses because I'm not doing any of this fantastic coding or mapping. The work that my COVID task force has been putting in place has been trying to affect the handling of the pandemic, but the stage that we're at the moment is trying to work out how to provide advice to the government in particular, so that things get handled better in the future. And one of the things I'm most keen to get your input on today is what we should be telling them, what good bits of practice can we highlight, and how can we make sure that their policy response, which is obviously going to be informed by all sorts of politics, is also informed by the experience of people who are actually dealing with the data on a day-by-day basis. And I guess where we start from is, our argument is that if you think about, well, what's gone wrong in the pandemic, data is the answer to many questions. And when we look at questions that are clinical, that are social, that are economic, very often, as you will no doubt have seen, at the root of those we find a problem of data, either a problem that we've not had access to the right data, that we didn't make investments to gather the data, or, and we'll all be too familiar with this, we had the right data and we ignored it. I'll just talk about a few of the areas that we are pushing on at the moment, but I would be really keen to hear about specific things that we would want government to be taking seriously. I think the first area where we keep coming up against problems, this is something, so our COVID-19 task force is led by Sylvia Richardson, a professor of biostatistics, and David Spiegelhalter, who is a sort of a professor and commentator on statistics who you'll be familiar with. They've been working on various of the government advisory groups, and we're trying to synthesize the things that they and the other members have been encountering. But the first problem that we really want to fix is timeliness of data. I guess really at the outset of the pandemic in the UK, we had this problem where we just weren't on the front foot with how quickly the problem was growing. I think there was a general feeling among people who were making decisions that we were maybe 4 weeks behind Italy, was the phrase you heard, when actually we were maybe 2 weeks behind. And the delay, that 2-week delay in responding, clearly, I think it's now recognised, in itself caused a really big problem, caused potentially thousands of deaths. So the question, first of all, is making sure that we've got the infrastructure in place to provide that data rapidly. The second thing, and I think I think John's example from North Yorkshire County Council really brought that home to me, the problem of underinvestment in local data. This is obviously part of a very big story, and one that ODI Leeds has told very effectively, but the fact that we've been underinvesting in the facilities of local government, of local public health to provide this information for decades, and consequently when we now need it, when we now need tools, we're reliant on heroic individuals putting things together. But how can we make the case for doubling down on that, providing more resources to people on the ground who are providing local data? Because one of the things that we know when we look at, for example, the way data has been provided in Hong Kong and Singapore, or actually even increasingly new places like New York have been good at this, data that is as localized as possible, as far as we can see, seems to affect people's behaviors more. We've spent a lot of time talking about testing as well. And I think here there is an issue of data transparency that some of you may be familiar with. It's less of a kind of open data problem, but it's a problem about openness of data, particularly before we started to get good vaccine news. But I think still, clearly there have been a lot of COVID mitigation plans that revolve around mass testing. One of the problems that we've encountered, and John Deeks on our task force from Birmingham University has been our expert on this, is that clearly, if you put in place a mass testing regime, a mass rapid testing regime, you need to know quite a lot of information about the accuracy of the tests, both their specificity and their sensitivity. And one of the issues that really becomes important if you're using these tests rapidly, especially if you're having them administered by non-clinicians, is the problem of false positives. Whenever I tweet about false positives, I always get lots of people saying, aha, you're admitting that there's a case-demic, which is not what we're saying. What we're saying in particular is because because rapid testings sometimes are associated with higher rates of false positive results, you need a fairly accurate idea of what those false positive rates are to design the testing regime. So you've got people like Michael Mina at Harvard University who are trying to design rapid testing regimes where you have sort of multiple rapid tests predicated on a low but not too low estimate of false positives. But what we've been encountering is the government has been spending hundreds of millions of pounds on rapid tests based on effectively, I had to choose my words carefully here, evidence provided by test manufacturers that doesn't necessarily reflect the effectiveness of these tests in the use to which they will be put. There's been a recent thing that we've been working on that came out in the BMJ about one of the rapid tests, the Innova rapid test, where this was a particular problem, and what lies at the bottom of this is if you or I want to release a pharmaceutical drug on the market, you know, you have to jump through a hell of a lot of hoops to prove that that's effective. If you want to produce a diagnostic test, the thresholds are much lower, and it's something where there's a huge need for us to be more demanding about the data that manufacturers put out there. Another thing that I think has really come out to us is just the investment in creating the data in the first place. And I think where this has really come home to roost is in coroner data, which some of you will no doubt be very closely involved with. Scotland, coroner data is pretty timely, pretty useful. And so if you want to kind of find out, earlier in the pandemic, we were very interested in the question of how quickly are COVID transmission, particularly COVID deaths, occurring among clinicians. So you're dealing with a relatively small group, so delays really matter. And it turned out that, as Professor Sheila Bird, one of our fellows, was showing, the Scottish coroner data is really good. Scottish coroners work quickly and publish their reports quite quickly. The England and Wales coroner data is relatively slow. So effectively, I think we would argue for these epidemiological purposes, it's basically useless. You're having to impute what the actual data are. And I think at one point Sheila Bird got to the point of writing to the Office of National Statistics and asking for England and Wales deaths to be taken out of the National Statistic Registrar, which is, in the world of statisticians, is kind of a declaration of war. But I think there's a real question about, well, we need to put in place the resources to make this work. And then the final thing that we're really interested in from a modelling point of view is the question of how you put together epidemiological data of the kind that we've been discussing and economic data. There is kind of one COVID skeptic argument, which we hear a lot, which says, well, if only you model the economic impact, you would not do lockdowns, and we would all just relax about COVID. And I think we fairly strongly reject that view. But what is really curious, again, there's an openness issue here. When the government takes on board scientific advice about epidemiology, those models are subject to some transparency, maybe not perfect transparency, but some transparency. They're put out there. As we saw a couple of weeks ago, when they put out data that is rubbish or badly presented, they get a lot of pushback on. And I think, cross fingers that actually the government are improving even some of those faults that they made a couple of weeks ago. Economic modelling is a totally different kettle of fish. That goes on in a black box. I don't even know whether there is an economic model for COVID lockdown going on within the Treasury. You'd hope there is, but we know there's an epidemiological model. We don't know whether there's an economic model. If the government want to reject scientific advice, there is, believe it or not, online there is a document about why and how they have to reject scientific advice. And maybe they don't always do the right thing, but there are rules, there's a process, there is something that you or I can come back to if they reject that kind of advice. Economic advice doesn't work like that, and it all happens in an entirely closed way. So I think there's a kind of, for anyone building tools, there is a real demand for a tool that even in a very crude way that people can pick apart, starts to look at lockdowns from a health point of view and from an economic point of view. And if people have those tools or know of them, please tell me, because that's just my ignorance that I've not come across the right ones yet. And but I think it's useful in its own right, But even a tool that's really rubbish and inaccurate and people pick holes in would be useful, because it would just start telling people that this is possible, and that being open about these things is something that we should think about. I think this is a great example of what Paul always tells me, which is that, you know, reports are very bad. People shouldn't publish reports, people should publish models. And I think in this particular instance, we can spend all our time telling the government, you should be open about economics, you should publish economic models, and they will ignore me, and they'll ignore you if you say that. But if someone can build a model that does that, that people can play with, that might be the thing that shames them into doing it. I've spoken for too long, but I would love to listen, and I would love to hear about things that we should be promoting, and other angles that people would think would work, so that next time this happens, and I'm sure there will be a next time, sadly, things go better. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Stian. And yeah, you've repeated a lot of the things we've seen. I mean, we've all seen that. And it's amazing how many people, as soon as the pandemic started ringing up ODI leads, expecting us to have the data in a plastic bag under the desk. That, have you got the data? You know, that data that answers all the questions we've got. And we had to kindly let them know that, well, have you invested in the last 10 years in creating that data? Well, no, of course we haven't. So, and I think the other point that I'm seeing a lot is that there's a rush to create new models and create new things to answer the questions we have, when actually, by being open and asking the questions, saying we don't know, we all know that these probably exist somewhere already, and there will be a thing. And Mark's just put in there the could we create an index of, you know, 1 death equals 1,000 jobs. Now I know, because we know that there's quite a lot of work been done on air quality around indexes of air quality levels equals so many deaths equals economic impact. My instinct is that this stuff already exists, and maybe we can look at how we repurpose some of the stuff that is over there. But I think that your final point there is that there needs to be an acceptance that we don't know, and that's really hard for institutions to do when they are set up to hold and distribute power. But I don't think anyone's expecting them to know. But then themselves, they think they need to have that authority so that they can have a legitimate way of wielding power. So, yeah, it all comes down to politics. But I think there's we're sort of giving ourselves a lot of work here then. But I'll stop talking. And would anyone else like to come in on what Stian mentioned there, or and indeed any of the other questions? Just put your hand up or raise your hand in Zoom or physically. Mark's got a question. Anyone else?
Just a comment, really. I think what Louise has written is absolutely spot on. And in any trust, I'll say, there are ethical decisions about who's allowed access to ITU, and whether you should give someone who's 95 and got multiple comorbidities a brand new hip. You know, those things go on all day long. And I think they take you into some really interesting analysis. But the thing that occurred to me at the moment is you've got a group of scientists interested in people not dying, and you've got a group of economists interested in the economy not tanking. And I wondered if there's some currency converter that they're actually using, or whether they're just two conversations that just kind of just bang into each other. It's just interesting intellectually.
Just a brief comment. You do have in Leeds the Institute of Interdisciplinary Ethics Applied, in which I did a recent master's, and actually tying some of those together with a group of ethicists who are used to engaging in real frontline stuff. They do a lot with medical ethics and the likes as well. Might be, I'm sure they'd be willing to have a conversation, and it's on your doorstep.
It's just bloody Yorkshire again, though, isn't it?
I could make an invitation. Shut up there, Mark. Shut up. You could rule the world quite happily.
Yeah, it's great. I hope the red wall comes.
Everyone's going to move to Yorkshire soon, mate. That's the
wow, yeah.
That will happen.
It's raining in here.
I think just one of the things that would be useful about building that model is that I think there's this question, you know, the interesting thing is that trade-off between lives saved and economic activity, which is actually, even the nature of that trade-off is something that's disputed. So by building the model, you kind of interrogate. So I think the lockdown skeptics would say it's a straight trade-off. I think a lot of other people would say, well, actually, that there's not such a straight trade-off, because actually lockdown has a longer term positive effect for the economy. And I think that's the kind of thing that's kind of you can discuss, but is actually, if you build it and you can toggle it, then it is it's easier to communicate that point.
Cool. So I think there's, but hopefully the ODI leads team and BI beautiful information picking that up. And I think we've started putting together catalogs of data, useful data assets, trying to put everything in one place. And that's the function of the opendatasaveslives.org website. And we always start with, okay, and we found this out right from the start of ODI Leads, is that the actual just putting everything in one place is so valuable for many people. And I think that what we'll do after this is, I think we'll raise that question about health and economics and just say, look, does anyone know? Well, do we know this? Are there models already around this? And maybe we could create a model that's that we know is not quite right, so people can chuck rocks at it and get us closer to an answer so quickly. So I think all three of the talks today have generated work and interest for all for some things we're looking at here. So fantastic. Are there any other questions for John, Peter, or Stian? No?
I put it in the chat because you're ignoring my hands.
So this is that Peter's just raised a point about influence and how we so I've just come off a call about energy, where people are expecting local authorities to have power to determine where energy investment goes. And I was just shocked by their lack of understanding that the local authorities, people don't exist anymore. They have no power, they only have no money. And there's this, and I think we've been working on this, is how do we organize ourselves to influence better? And then, yeah, I think that Peter's point around how do we create ways to influence without sounding like we're all chippy northerners, which can be, or chippy people from the southeast, Mark.
Yeah, it's good to be inclusive.
But you're a fellow, yeah.
I would say I'm chippy.
Yeah. So Stian, I guess it's a question to you about how do we organise ourselves to be more influential?
I mean, one thing you've got going for you is, I think you're really good at building tools that people can actually use and play with, and that's kind of good in itself. It's good as a way of finding the right answers to problems, but it's also good because it's different. You know, there are loads of people trying to influence policy who are publishing reports. I think just the very fact, if you're talking about data, or if you're talking about something that has even just a scientific and technical dimension with data in it, the fact that you're building models about these things, that is just an incredibly effective way of communicating it. It sort of proves to some extent that you're starting this with some quantitative chops, and a lot of people in this debate, kind of as Toby Young proved yesterday, don't necessarily have those skills. So that's a huge advantage. I think I like to think government is actually a bit more influenceable now than they sometimes are, because this is a sort of problem that they're bamboozled by, and everyone is. You know, it's not just them. So it's a bit more of an open door than if you try to lobby them on something like Brexit, which they have a very fixed position on and has been debated for many years, and everyone knows the arguments. In terms of specific things, I think there are a few select committee inquiries coming out, which are quite good platforms for getting some of these ideas into politics. So there is, I think, in fact, Paul, I just see you mentioned there is a PACAC inquiry next week. So I know we're giving evidence at it. You guys should consider doing that as well. The other thing, God, I don't want to get you into the world of replying to select committees, but there is a select committee coming up, which is accepting evidence till the end of November, which is a joint inquiry by the Health Select Committee and the Science and Technology Select Committee. And the only reason I mention it is because I sort of suspect those guys are really going to want to make quite a big stir. And that includes all things about data and COVID. and it's coming up relatively soon. The chairs of that committee, sorry, this is very inside baseball Westminster stuff, are two former cabinet ministers who no doubt kind of want to be seen to be speaking truth to power because they're not in the current government, and they're both very sensible. So that could be if you want to get into lobbying, that's not that's another opportunity of doing it. But
okay, sounds like, Peter, you might have to we can work on Open Data Saves Lives response to the you're pretty good at writing, aren't you? Maybe we can maybe we
Peter's a published author. He'd be great.
Yeah.
He handed me a book with his name on the front.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay, there's lots of chats in there about using tools. This is exactly what Open Data Saves Lives is about. Is that loads of stuff's going on the sidelines, which is helping people, which is great. So I'm going to try and finish before 12. Please look up for. I'm just going to put a link in the chat. So Open Data Saves Lives.org. So this got launched basically this week. So the website is live now. We exist. We're going to take this forward. We are, fingers crossed, 95% sure we're going to be working with the Health Foundation on a work around remote consultations. It's quite a dry subject, but basically we're going to do it in an Open Data Saves Lives way. So everything will be open. Our proposal will be open. Our findings will be open. Our work as we go will be open. We had a call with TPP and Mark's been talking to EMIS. They're both going to join in. Famously not very open organisations, but they want to join in with our work around that. NHSX have been in touch saying, what's going on? We've just started a collaboration and convening thing and set up directors. We need to find out what you're up to, which is great. And then next year we've got if you see Gary Rush, who's on the line, he's going to be leading our push to the corporate world, mainly in London financial institutions who would like to support what we're doing. And we've also got commitments from the Health Foundation, if we get this right, that they would help underpin some of the overhead required to run this. So the reason I'm interested in talking to you, John, is about, we don't just want to run a nice community where we all get on. We like to build tools and share. And if we can find use cases for that investment, which for example could mean that North Yorkshire's local authority data team builds stuff and we can help fund the overhead for you to share that with everybody. And we don't wait around for people to give us money to do that. We actually get ourselves organized. So there's a bit of a business plan with that. So lots of things coming together that we would love you all to join in with. This is not an exclusive club. Please share it. Please tell your friends. And now we've got a website. There will obviously be a mailing list and a tattoo to get to join with Open Data Saves Lives. Mark, you've got a comment there.
We should just pitch the next one. So we're doing a session in December all about ethnicity. So we think that BAME is the wrong way to analyse all of this stuff. And we're going to have 3 experts explaining why that's the case. So that's on the 3rd at 11. Be fantastic if you could come and spread the word, and we'll see you then in 2 weeks.
Fantastic. We'll finish within the hour. Thanks everyone for coming. And yeah, tell all your friends and see us next week when Mark's going to challenge all of some of the assumptions around communication of ethnicity.
Thanks all.